Welcome to Science Fiction 101, the podcast series where we explore the science fiction field from all angles, covering the past, the present, and the future. We're your hosts. I'm Phil.
And I'm Colin.
And today we're going to be considering science fiction vacations. And I think we also may have a fiendish quiz coming up. Is that right, Colin?
That is true. It's short but fiendish.
Okay. But first, some follow-ups on our last episode where we reviewed the unfilmed screenplay for Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Via Facebook, Steve wrote, "Great podcast. I didn't know about the background of the making of the film." So we've informed at least one listener by the sound of it. And then Joey wrote, "I enjoyed the podcast and added it to my favourites list on Stitcher. I look forward to catching up on episodes. And have you seen this excellent documentary about the making of Close Encounters in Mobile, Alabama?" And it's a documentary called Who Are You People? And I haven't seen it before. Colin, have you seen it?
I hadn't even heard about it, no.
No, me neither. No, I haven't watched it yet. I do intend to at some point. But from what I recall of the making of the film, Spielberg took over 2 giant aircraft hangars in Mobile, Alabama, because he couldn't find a studio that was big enough for his exterior scenes, which he wanted to film indoors because of, being able to control things.
Right.
So I gather it's about the film company moving lock, stock and barrel to Alabama. Thanks for that tip-off. And then via Twitter, Emmanuel, one of our regulars, wrote, "It was really interesting to hear you two discuss what could have been versus what actually was. And to me, it highlights Spielberg's genius as a filmmaker. I firmly believe that story, put in a lesser director's hands, would have been quite dull." And he goes on to say, "But Spielberg delivered a touching, lively story with some ideas taken directly from his cinema idol, Francois Truffaut, who plays the French scientist Claude Lacombe in the movie. It shows mostly in the camera movements and the way it tracks characters in a scene." So thanks, Emmanuel, for that. So thanks for the comments. Keep the comments coming in. If you have any observations, want to discuss anything with us or ask any questions, you can contact us through our webpage, which is 101sf.blogspot.com, and you can also find us on Facebook as Science Fiction 101. Now, let's go on vacation. Where are we going to go, Colin?
There's several options, although when I envisioned this podcast, it didn't go the way that I thought it would.
Uh-huh.
I was anticipating finding museums all over the United States, all over the world, to science fiction, to various authors, and I either could not find it or did not find it.
Right.
Or they don't exist. So I expanded the scope of this a little bit so that we also include not only museums, but story and film locations.
Right. Just between you and me, we had a little spreadsheet going where we jotted down our ideas for this. We could make a version of that and put that on our webpage.
Oh, definitely.
Yep.
Yeah. In fact, I was hoping that after we were through with the podcast and it's posted, that we would talk to the fine people at File 770 and maybe some other online communities and get other ideas. There's no reason this can't become the semi-canonical list of science fiction destinations.
Terrific. So how do you want to go forward with this? Would you like to pick one item that you put on the list and then maybe I'll pick one of mine?
Sure, yeah. We had just done Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and so I picked Devil's Tower National Monument, which is in Wyoming.
Hooray. Have you ever been there?
I have not. I think I've flown over it, but that's
wow.
about as close as I've gotten.
Wow. I haven't seen it either in real life. What I did do is look it up on Google Maps and look at the aerial view of it, from above. And there's no landing strip there.
There's no landing strip. They've hidden it.
Yeah.
Either that or Google is working with them now.
Ah, conspiracy. But yeah, that's a great place. Obviously, if you went there, I suppose the most you could do is look at it and say, that was in Close Encounters. Because there's nothing there in terms of a museum or anything, is there? Or is there?
I don't believe there is.
No. Shall I name one of the items I put on the list?
Sure.
I've put the whole of Manhattan on there as a science fiction location of interest. Now, the reason for doing that is, well, there's two aspects to it. One is that there are lots of places in and around Manhattan which have appeared in science fiction films. But there's also, in a more generic sense, to me, New York City, and Manhattan in particular, is science fiction. And what I mean by that is, whenever I see Manhattan, and I've been there, I think, 2 or 3 times, and whenever I've seen it in movies, it resembles real life, but it looks like an extrapolation of the real life that I know, in terms of the way the streets are laid out, in terms of the type of traffic there is, the number of people, the density of the population. It's every bit a science fictional vision to me as, say, watching Blade Runner, where you get that futuristic blending of cultures in the street scenes in Blade Runner. So to me, that's what Manhattan is. But to be a bit more concentrated on individual locations, I would point to the Statue of Liberty, which has appeared in a number of science fiction films, most notably the end of Planet of the Apes. And I've been inside the Statue of Liberty, climbed up to the top, and it's a marvellous, miraculous place. And it's just as exciting to me as a tourist as it was to Charlton Heston when he saw it lying on the beach at the end of the Apes movie. Spoiler. I mean, there are other films that are set in New York as well, but I grew up on the Apes movies, and beneath the Planet of the Apes has James Franciscus as the second astronaut crew member to arrive on the planet. He goes on a tour of New York, and I made a list of all the places that you see. Grand Central Station, you see Radio City Music Hall, you see the New York Stock Exchange, Queensboro Plaza subway station, I think it is, and various other locations as well. Now, in the film, they're either film sets or models or paintings, so they're not the real locations. They didn't actually film in New York. However, they are so iconic and realistic, depicted as ruins in the film, that the first time I went to Manhattan, almost every time I turned a corner I would see something and say, oh, I've seen that in such and such a film. So to me, the whole place is a very science fictional location. And if we're talking about actual vacations, places that you might go and then spend time in, New York is one of my favourite places to go, because there's always something new to do.
Cool. The first museum that I thought of, and one that I've actually been to, is the Science Fiction and Fantasy Hall of Fame in Seattle, Washington.
Right. Now, I've heard about that, and I've seen pictures of it. Is it very impressive?
Impressive in content, yes. Impressive in scope, not so much. It's very small.
Really?
It's a sub-museum inside of a larger museum, the Museum of Popular Culture, which I do recommend a visit to because it is incredible. Mm-hmm. But it's a subsection of a very large building.
Right.
Filled all with Paul Allen's and other donations, collected, books and costumes and movie props. One of the coolest things about it is, right as you're buying your ticket, you're walking underneath Rick Decker's car from Blade Runner.
Oh, wow.
And it's all lit up and suspended above you.
Is it a real prop, do you know, or is it a reconstruction?
I want to say it is a real prop.
Wow.
But, that's the advantage of having all the money you could want and more to spend on whatever you want and more. There are collections of guns. There are collections of some old books and movie posters.
The Seattle Museum that you've spoken of reminds me a little bit of the only real museum that we have in the UK to do with science fiction, which is called the National Film and Science Fiction Museum, or actually National Film and Sci-Fi Museum, I think they call it, which I did mention on a fairly early episode of the podcast after I'd visited it. It's in Milton Keynes in England. Quite small as museums go, but full of lots of little interesting things, lots of costumes, lots of real props from movies and that kind of thing. And I imagine it's something that might grow over time. So I've put that on the list as probably because it's the only real thing that we have. Although I noticed that you also added a British museum.
So I was madly Googling for things and looking at lists and using Google as a general search engine. And I came across the Museum of Classic Science Fiction in Allendale Town, UK.
Yeah.
And I just dropped a link to it.
My impression of it is that it's one person's personal collection of stuff, which is probably very interesting, but I imagine it's quite small. Maybe one day, especially if they invite me, I'll go and have a look. I did look at the website after you put the link into the spreadsheet, and I think they're only pretty much open about 3 days a week or something. So it's not a massive museum, but nevertheless probably very good. If any listeners have been there, let us know. Tell us what it's like.
I did add a museum that you should be aware of already, the Ray Bradbury Experience Museum in Waukegan, Illinois.
Yes. What do you know about that one?
Unfortunately, only what I could find online. It's a celebration of Ray Bradbury's life and work in his hometown, and there are some interactive displays.
Yeah, and I think it's still under development, so it's an ever-changing picture. It's one of those things, I think if you happen to be in the area and you're a Bradbury fan, it's worth dropping in. But whether it's worth travelling across country to get there, I don't know. I've not been myself. There is another Bradbury one, which, again, I have mentioned a couple of times in the past, which is the Ray Bradbury Centre, which is a different thing, and in a different place. It's in Indianapolis, and that's where all of Bradbury's papers are stored, and most of his professional artefacts. So things like his typewriters, his office furniture, all of the knickknacks that he kept in his office, and all of his awards as well. His Emmy Award, his Peabody Award. What else did he have? He had a Pulitzer Prize, they've got that. So the Ray Bradbury Centre is home to a reconstruction of Bradbury's office. Again, it's one of those, it's well worth a visit if you're in the area of Indianapolis and you're a Bradbury fan. You can go online and you can book a tour. You can't just turn up on the day, you have to book in advance. And you'll be shown around, you'll be shown all the artefacts. I don't think they let you sit in Bradbury's chair anymore, because somebody pointed out that that's quite a valuable artefact. But they used to let people sit in the chair at Bradbury's desk and have their photo taken. Now, I have been to that one. I've been to that many times, and it's a great place to go.
Well, and you found a particular videotape in the collection there, if I remember right.
I did, yes. That's where I was rummaging through all of Ray Bradbury's old VHS tapes, and I found that he had a copy of the first cut of Something Wicked This Way Comes, which was a preview version of the film that was shown to a preview audience, and they hated it. So the film was reworked, basically.
So, okay, quick side note. Do you have a VCR?
Not anymore, no. I mean, I did at that time. That was about, when was that? That was probably about 5 or 6 years ago now. And yes, I did have a VCR at that time, but not when I was in Indianapolis. I just used one that they had in the Bradbury Centre.
Oh, okay. I guess that makes more sense than, taking it with you as luggage as you're traveling.
Oh, yeah.
Just in case, The next filming location that I thought of after Devil's Tower was the Cheyenne Mountain Complex that houses NORAD. Yeah,
tell me about that, because I saw that on the list, and I didn't recognise the name of that one.
Oh, yeah. When the Stargate SG-1 science fiction series was made, the Stargate is housed inside of NORAD.
Right.
And during the credits and during cutscenes and stuff, there would be, a shot of the mountain complex from the outside, or looking out from it across the roads and the plains. And it also features very prominently in the series Robopocalypse. Right.
And NORAD, I think, is the organisation that tracks Santa every Christmas, isn't it?
They do Santa one day a year, and then the rest of the year they monitor a bunch of the rest of the airspace for the United States.
Oh yeah, I'm sure they have other things to keep them busy.
I don't think it's open to the public. That was one of the reasons I left Area 51 off this list, because it is most definitely closed to the public. although if I remember right, sometime during the pandemic, there was an attempted effort to crowdsource a literal crowd that were going to flood invade Area 51 because they were saying, well, they can't possibly shoot us all. And the government assured them that they could.
Yes.
And so the whole thing kind of faltered and fell apart.
Yeah, we have enough guns. We can do it.
Yeah.
We can shoot the whole lot of you. On my addition to the list, I put in Griffith Observatory, which is in Los Angeles, and it's an observatory. And I've been there. I think I've been there twice because I've been to LA a couple of times. And I'm pretty sure I went to Griffith Observatory more than once. It's sort of up in the hills, as observatories tend to be, and you get a great view of LA sort of down below, and it's a great spot to just sort of look at the skyline of downtown Los Angeles from a distance. And it's popped up in all sorts of films. I think it was in one of James Dean's films, I'm pretty sure. Can't remember which one. But it's also in all sorts of science fiction films and TV shows. I've seen it more often in TV shows, simply because the architecture of the building, it's sort of got these stone domes, if you like, and they look quite alien or from another culture. They could almost be Arabian from certain angles, or they could be futuristic. And they've popped up in more than one episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. And I've seen them in other films as well. So it's a great place. It's got some really nice architectural features. And it's got a planetarium, which is named after Leonard Nimoy. Or at least it was when I was last there. So I hope they've kept the honouring of Mr. Nimoy there. So Griffith Observatory is one of my favourite places on Earth, frankly. I'm fascinated by space, and they've got some really good displays in there and a great planetarium. So I heartily recommend that one if you're in the area.
Well, and if you were there for some other reason, I don't know why else you'd go to LA. I mean, why not take a little side trip for a half day?
Well,
Get out of the town, see the sights.
That's it.
It was part of the inception of this idea was we've talked about whether or not you should be widely read as a science fiction fan. Right? Maybe you just follow a particular author or a particular genre. Should you read old stuff? Should you only read new stuff? Being well-traveled and seeing the world allows you to see when other people bring it into science fiction, how it interacts with science fiction and changes with it over time.
Yes. And one thing that I find really fascinating is places which turn up in films are often everyday places to the people who make the films, but they seem exotic to me as a viewer. If I've never seen Griffith Observatory in real life, when I see it on screen, it looks like a film set. It looks like it's been made for the movies.
The Louvre in Paris reminds me of that. I've never been there, and yet because of its shape, design, and what's in it, it's often used in science fiction, and it's in some fantasy settings as well.
Yeah. Which films have you seen that in? I remember it being in... Oh, I forgot what it's called. The film based on Dan Brown's book, Tom Hanks.
The Da Vinci Code.
The Da Vinci Code, thank you. Yes, that's the only one I can think of, but it must be in some others as well.
It features in the ending parts of Tomorrow Never Dies.
Ah, yes.
And it has some art that might be fun to see too.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah. One of the others that I have been to, that I added to the list, is Kennedy Space Center. Simply because it is, I mean, it's not science fiction, it's science fact. It's full of real space stuff, such as a complete Saturn V rocket. But there's something about that old Apollo stuff that sort of becomes science fiction because it is so culturally distant from where we are now in many ways. It feels very science fiction-y, and we've spoken before on the podcast about films like Apollo 13, which isn't science fiction because it's based on a true story. But nevertheless, it has many of the elements of good science fiction. And the same is true of Kennedy Space Center. It is not science fiction, but boy does it feel science fiction-y when you go around it. I've been there a couple of times, and again, it's one of my favourite places on Earth. but being able to see launch control, being able to walk underneath a Saturn V rocket, which is enormous.
Well, and to think about more science fiction, I know those launches were broadcast live on television. Today, they'll be streamed live in super high definition all around the world.
Yeah.
I was going to save this quote for later in the podcast because we were going to do our past, present, and future section, but it's particularly relevant.
Yeah.
About a book I'm reading by Steve Davidson and Kermit Woodall, talking about Hugo Gernsback and Amazing Stories.
Mm-hmm.
And he said that Gernsback was using the idea of using fantastical stories, like those that had inspired him, to interest people in becoming involved with science and technology.
Mm-hmm.
That's the very birth of science fiction.
Yes.
And so when you go to a place like the Apollo Museum or the Boeing Museum, which is also in Washington and kind of peripheral to what we're talking about, that's exactly what that's doing. It brings that sense of awe and wonder and what if. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yes. Give us another one of yours off the list.
San Francisco, the home of Starfleet Academy in Star Trek. There's only a couple of actual scenes from various shows and movies that are there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, who wouldn't want to go visit the grounds of Starfleet Academy and see where Boothby had been working, or maybe visit, I guess Jean-Luc Picard's vineyard is in France.
Yeah, but I hear you can just hop in a transporter and get there in a few seconds, so it's not that far away, really.
No.
It's funny that you put San Francisco, because it's another place that looks quite alien. Not alien in the sense of being on another planet, but it looks unlike any other city because of the architecture and the fact that it's on hills and it's got that massive bay with a big bridge going across it. No other city quite looks like it. And that's what I think draws filmmakers to it, and lots of films have been set there. I don't know how many of the Star Trek films and series have used it as a real establishing shot, but you forever seem to be seeing the Golden Gate Bridge with a little shuttle pod flying over the top of it.
That's exactly the scene I'm thinking of right now.
Yeah. It's probably the same piece of footage, isn't it, that they're using again and again in as many films as they can.
Yeah. Probably.
Now, I added to the list it's a very small thing, this, but in the British town of Woking, there is a sculpture of a War of the Worlds tripod, and also the I don't know what you call it, but the pod that first lands on Earth in War of the Worlds, which then unscrews and out come the aliens with their tripods. So there's a sculpture of those two things in Woking Town Centre. I've never actually visited, but I've seen photos multiple times. And Woking is one of those places, no offence to anyone who lives in Woking, but it's one of those places, there's no particular reason to go there. But if you happen to be in the vicinity of Woking, certainly drop in and go and look at these tripods. And certainly that's something I've been saying for years. When I'm in Woking, I'm going to go and look at those. But I've never had a reason to go there.
Well, now you do.
Now I do.
I guess you could one could do a worldwide science fiction exhibit scavenger hunt kind of a thing.
Yes. I'm just thinking of a little sideline there for our podcast.
Yeah. The corresponding part to the original Wells novel is the radio broadcast.
Yes.
Now, I don't know if there are any exhibits or anything in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, but that is where Orson Welles' podcast was set. Not his podcast, his radio broadcast.
Oh, I love that idea.
Yeah, it had some popularity when it was originally put out in 1938. There were some effects because of what he did.
Yeah, and still remembered to this day. Even people who haven't listened to any radio drama in their life have still heard of that one. There is actually a monument there. There's a little sculpture with a plaque and some text. Again, I've never been, but I've seen photos on the web. The fascinating thing is that Grover's Mill is a real place, because you assume it's fictional, just as I imagine a lot of people reading Wells's novel assume that all the places he mentions are fictional, but they're not. They're real. Woking is in the book. That's why they have the sculpture of the tripod. So what we'll have to do, you'll have to go there and take a photo, do a selfie of yourself in front of the Grover's Mill monument, and I'll have to go to Woking.
You know, things like that radio broadcast that people tuned into and became horribly scared, that still happens today.
Yeah.
Things like that. Although no, it happens on YouTube, where they have dramatized series that are usually first-person recordings of influencers and other people that are famous, and they begin to weave this story into their fake life, which they've recorded on YouTube, and then something bad happens, like they're kidnapped or they see an alien invasion, and then you know that the entire thing was a dramatized play.
Yeah. There's one other item I've put on the list that I've not visited, but I would dearly love to visit, and that is the Star Trek set tour, which is in Ticonderoga, New York. And it has immaculate recreations of the USS Enterprise as seen in the original series. And they were not built just to be replicas, they were built as film sets because there was a fan series being made. This was the fan series called Star Trek Phase 2, or originally it was called something else. I think it was Star Trek New Voyages. And they built the sets purely practically so that they could film this continuation of Star Trek, the original series, purely made by fans and funded by fans, and, you know, not a commercial proposition at all. Those kind of productions are pretty much gone now because Paramount Pictures changed their mind about what they would allow fans to do and more or less said no more fan films. You can make short pieces now. I think you can make a 10-minute Star Trek film as a fan, but you can't make a full-length thing anymore. But those sets remain, and when the Star Trek Phase 2 episodes had to come to an end, they turned it into an exhibit, and they are now officially licensed by Paramount. So it is the official Star Trek tour. And they have people from Star Trek turning up. So William Shatner puts in appearances every now and again.
Oh, wow.
Obviously, those ones sell out instantly. They're advertised. But it's not just him. They have other people from Star Trek, both from in front of the camera and behind the camera. And you get shown around by people who know what they're talking about. You know, and that is somewhere that I would make a trip specifically to see. I would cross continents to see that.
Well, I'll make you a deal. If you determine when you're going to go, let me know, and I'll see about, maybe meeting you there.
Great, yes.
I have a couple more, and yeah. They're somewhat cheesy. We've stayed fairly pure, I would say, in our science fiction discussions and stuff, but I threw in a cryptid museum, which happens to be, down the way from where I live in Sandy, Oregon. Okay. It's the North American Bigfoot Center. And they specialize in the history of Bigfoot and in sightings. And unusually, unlike UFOs, which seems to have disappeared aside from military cameras, with the advent of cell phones, a lot of cryptids seem to have disappeared.
I thought you were going to say that Bigfoot is now proven.
Bigfoot's now proven.
By the use of cell phones.
Well, there was an excellent Bigfoot story written by Max Brooks.
Right.
Called Devolution. If you like that kind of, found diary story with set in modern times, little bit of technology science fiction, not very much. Mm-hmm. It's a great read.
The only Bigfoot in science fiction that I remember is it was either $6 Million Man or Bionic Woman episodes. Did you ever see those?
I did.
Talk about Jump the Shark.
I still want to see the remake of The $6 Million Man with Mark Wahlberg, which is supposed to be coming out sometime.
Oh, really? There was a remake of The Bionic Woman a few years ago, wasn't there? As a TV series. But it didn't last long.
No, that's a shame. Well, maybe it's a shame. Maybe it wasn't very good. Who knows?
Yeah, maybe. I think I did see the first episode, but I can't remember anything about it.
That's not a good sign.
That you can't remember? Yeah. Oh, I put in the Bradbury Building in Los Angeles, which is not named after Ray Bradbury, but it is featured in the title sequence of Ray Bradbury Theatre. Every episode begins with the lift from that building, and it's also in Blade Runner, and it's also in the Outer Limits episode called Demon with a Glass Hand. And it's probably been in a few other science fictional things as well, because it's got some quite unusual architecture. It's quite a distinctive building. It's quite small. I was expecting something very large, but it turns out to be quite a modest building in size. It's just very ornate on the inside. And again, it's not the sort of place to cross a continent to get to, but if you happen to be in Los Angeles, check it out. It's just downtown. You can walk to it if you're in downtown. And you can just wander in off the street. There's a few little framed information displays about the building in various films. You can't really go anywhere beyond the lobby because it's a business building, so you'd have to have an appointment with somebody in the building. But it's quite fascinating to just pop inside there and see the familiar architecture, take a few pictures and then walk out. There
was an American television show called Leverage with Timothy Hutton. Have you heard of it?
Yes, but I've never seen it.
The last 3.5 years of it were filmed in and around Portland. Mm-hmm. And my family used to do a game where we would watch it and try to identify where they were filming, purely based on appearance, which is kind of what we've been talking about. So that's fun. Yeah. So we've talked about 2 authors so far. Actually, really one author, Ray Bradbury, who has 2 museums. Mm-hmm. The only other author I could find that has a dedicated exhibit to them was H.P. Lovecraft.
Right, yeah.
So in his hometown of Providence, Rhode Island, there's a self-guided walking tour. So you can see parts of his life and places where he lived and did things. And I didn't check to see if they had a museum stop or not. But I expected to see one for Arthur C. Clarke or Isaac Asimov or any of the really big older names, and they just don't exist.
Clarke would be an interesting one because, of course, he lived in Sri Lanka. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure I have seen that his house was sort of preserved after his death by the family that he sort of lived with him. But yeah, that's interesting. I'm going to look that up, see if I can find any more about that. But yeah, you're right. There should be more museums to authors. In general, there are museums to authors in various places. I mean, in the UK, there are various Dickens museums. There's one in the place he was born, another in the place where he worked. There are museums to people like Agatha Christie. And I know in the States there is a Willa Cather museum. Obviously there's the Bradbury one that we've spoken of. There's a memorial library and museum for Kurt Vonnegut, which is in Indianapolis. And some other writers as well, but I can't remember offhand. But you're right, science fiction seems to be a bit unrepresented.
Yeah, there are memorial awards, like the Ursula K. Le Guin competition.
Yeah.
And I think I saw online that the family and friends of Harlan Ellison are trying to start a museum.
Funny you should mention that, because I've got that down as a future item for later. Oh. So, yes, we'll come to that.
Yeah, okay, good. From this list, if you have been to these places and we haven't talked about them enough and you want to tell us more about them, or I would guarantee that, despite the reputation of Google as a search engine, there are more places than we know about in the United States, in the UK, all around the world. And there should be a place to find them.
Yeah.
And so you had mentioned maybe we could put up a page on our website for this and keep it up to date with things that we hear from people that are appropriate and interesting to other people for visiting and knowing about.
Yeah, I think we should. We've got at the moment 25 items on the list by the look of it. But there must be more. Must be many more.
Yeah. Well, if we added filming locations, I think you could put things all around the world. But I think after a while, those start to lose interest a little bit. Yeah,
especially if they are now different, or the best thing you can say is that something was shot on this location, but it didn't look like this. So like Lord of the Rings, you could go to New Zealand and say, they shot the Battle of such and such here, and it's just a field. Those kind of things are not interesting. But places where there is some kind of memorial, some kind of museum, or something that is iconically memorable, such as a building or a piece of architecture.
Yeah. knowing that Star Wars was shot in Tunisia is interesting. Going to see the dunes and being there, maybe not so much. Who knows? I think just before our last recording, Queen Elizabeth passed away.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Yes,
it was an event.
Kind of dominated. It took over British television for at least a week. Everything was cancelled.
I had remembered a particular time that I saw the Queen in popular media, and it made me wonder, for someone that was so well known all around the world, if she might have become a character in various stories or movies. And it turns out she had. Queen Elizabeth showed up several times in science fiction and comics and movies. And so I thought I would ask our resident British culture expert on our team if he was aware of these things.
Oh, you mean me?
Yeah. So let me ask you a series of questions and see how well you know when Queen Elizabeth showed up in science fiction.
Okay.
So I don't know if the Queen had a sweet tooth, but she placed what was likely to be the winning bid for a particular box of chocolate bars in this fanciful 1970s movie.
Is this science fiction or is this more fantasy?
It is more fantasy.
Is it anything to do with Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory?
It is.
Oh, how does that work?
It turns out that as the supply of chocolate was diminishing, as people were searching for the last golden ticket in Britain, they auctioned off the last box of Wonka bars. Right. And the auctioneer takes bids from various people, and then he goes, $1 million. Oh, Your Majesty. She's not shown, but she is definitely referenced.
Of course. Very good.
Okay. This one is a little more esoteric. In this animated sequel, the Queen, portrayed as a vintage roadster, bestows an honorary knighthood on Lightning McQueen's friend, Mater.
Now, you said roadster. Now, a roadster, to me, is a car. Is that right?
That is correct.
So is this Cars 2?
It is. Yeah, they took the Queen and they made her a literal vintage roadster with a crown. And when the main character's best friend ends up saving the world, he gets an honorary knighthood from her. Good
grief. I've never seen Cars 2. I've seen Cars 1, or as we call it, Cars. But I've never seen Cars 2.
See, now that's the advantage of having young children at the right time.
Ah, you've made up my mind for me that I don't ever want to see Cars 2.
Oh dear, don't tell Pixar. Okay, question 3. While I'd guess the royal family has excellent medical care, the Queen met with a particular medical professional in several of his incarnations from 1988 to 2007.
Medical professional incarnations. Well, that suggests a doctor who keeps coming back as somebody else. So are we talking Doctor Who?
Yes. Yeah, she appeared in character in at least 3 different Doctor Who episodes, including my favorite one where a broadcast was used by her to wipe people's faces off.
Yeah, she was known for that.
Face wiping?
Yeah.
Oh, dear.
Marvelous.
Okay, last question. You're doing very well so far.
It's amazing, isn't it? Because when you started on this, I was thinking, I cannot think of any single instances of her appearing in a science fiction or fantasy film, ever. But you've given me 3, and weirdly, I've got the answer right 3 times.
All right, let's see if we can make you 4 for 4.
Okay.
The Queen co-starred with what dapper member of her intelligence community in a 2012 short where they parachuted from a helicopter into a stadium?
Okay, now that one's quite easy. That was James Bond, and that was for the Olympics.
Yes.
And that was really her. All these other ones you've referred to, presumably, it was either she was never shown, or she was animated, or she was played by an actor. But this one was really her, wasn't it?
I don't know if she did the actual parachuting at the end.
Oh, no.
But I'm thinking all the rest of the time she was actually there.
Yes. I mean, by the same token, when Daniel Craig parachutes out of a helicopter or a jet aircraft, it's probably not really him doing it. You know, stunt doubles and all that.
Yeah, it probably depends on the insurance cost and the actor's willingness.
So did I get 4 out of 4?
You did.
That's amazing.
I don't think you were into comic books very much. These were all very popular culture, but she also appeared in the comic books several times being drawn.
Well, thank you for that, Colin. On behalf of the British nation, we're amazed to find out how important Her Majesty was to the fields of science fiction and fantasy. Shall we do our past, present and future?
Yeah, let's.
Past. I've got a past one, and that is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, which I realised the other day is 90 years old this year. It was published in 1932, so it's 90 years old. Probably one of the best dystopian novels, and certainly one of the most influential dystopian novels. And I learned a little piece of trivia in the last couple of weeks, which I had gone through life not knowing, and that is that Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, was a teacher at one point in his life, and among his students was George Orwell, author of 1984.
Wow.
So they knew each other, and that never occurred to me.
Yeah, from one dystopian to the next.
Yeah, passing it on down the generations. I was on the Wikipedia page about Brave New World, and there's a quote on there from Neil Postman, who's a sort of a famous cultural commentator, and he made a comparison between what Orwell did in 1984 and what Huxley does in Brave New World. And I thought this was really very interesting because it makes Huxley's book sound like it's very appropriate for the world we live in right now. And Neil Postman wrote these words in either the 1980s or the 1990s, so it was a long time ago. But this is what Neil Postman said. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was that there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who wanted to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. And then the last bit, Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. And reading that, wow, that is everything that he says Huxley fears is the world we're in right now. Have you read it?
Yes.
And what do you think of it?
I'm not very objective when it comes to things like that.
Yeah.
So it's a fantastic story. It's really well written. It's massively influential. But the thing that it portrays is so bad, so awful, that I have a hard time going, oh, this is very enjoyable. I have a couple of things from the past. The first one is I read my first Alan Steele short story, The Good Rat.
Oh, very good.
Which was written in 1995. And I absolutely loved it. It was incredible. The science fiction was a background. It's really more of a redemption story with these science fiction overtones.
Yeah.
But I was introduced to a new author, and I look forward to reading more of his works in the future.
Fantastic.
And the other one is a book called Amazing Sense of Wonder, Science Fiction's First Award Winners. Mm-hmm. Edited and stuff, and that's a quote, by Steve Davidson and Kermit Woodall. And I mentioned the quote from the book earlier in the show. Mm-hmm. And the idea is that in 1926, in the magazine Amazing Stories, Hugo Gernsback ran the first known science fiction contest, which was to write a 5,000 to 10,000 word story about an image plate from that Pulp magazine's episode.
Right, yes.
And somehow they tracked down as many of the stories they could. They have the winner, many of the runner-ups, and then some extra stories that were all submitted, and it's bound into a book. You can buy a hard copy, you can buy an ebook. I bought a copy because I was really curious, and I read the first one, and it was very, very good. Quite delightful, as a matter of fact. It reminds me of last year, we did an episode, and I'm pulling this off the top of my head, and I should have written notes, where a man travels through time to the future, where they trade bodies with people. It's written in that kind of a vein.
Yeah. So moving on to the present, then, there's a website which I don't think I've mentioned before on the podcast. There's a website out there called Clockworks 2, it's actually a wiki site, so anybody can contribute to it. And it's set up by Rich Ehrlich, who's a science fiction critic. And it's described on the site as an analytical selected list with comments of works useful for the study of the human-machine interface in science fiction. And it's just really good. It's one of those things you can sit and browse, and you'll stumble across things that you've read or things that you've seen in movies, and obviously links between parts of the wiki and to things outside of the wiki as well. So it's just a really nice site, and it might be something that some of our listeners might feel that they can contribute to as well, because it's an ever-growing thing. So that's called Clockworks 2. I have one other present item, which was a very odd little Twitter spat that was going on a couple of weeks ago at the time of recording, and I've turned away from it now, so I don't know what happened to it in the end. But the famous author, non-science fiction author, Joyce Carol Oates, seems to have discovered science fiction. She's quite old now. I don't know how old she is. I think she's probably in her 80s or something. From what I can gather, she attended some presentation by Ted Chiang, the famous science fiction writer, and she came away with these ideas of what science fiction were, allegedly based on what Chiang had said. And she was either misquoting or very badly paraphrasing, because she came out with some very bizarre tweets about what science fiction does and doesn't do, and also fantasy. And there's this one that I just copied and pasted part of it. She tweeted this: mystery/detective/police or legal procedurals are antithetical to horror/fantasy. If you like one, you will not usually like the other, because traditional mysteries must be realistic. Otherwise, detection makes no sense. Okay, so she's pontificating on mystery stories in relation to horror and fantasy, and hundreds of people chimed in with responses to this, basically saying you're totally wrong. One person just posted an image, a frame grab from an episode of Scooby-Doo. And there's the proof. The Mystery Machine, Scooby-Doo, it's all about mystery and horror/fantasy. Complete proof that she's totally wrong about this, and so many other aspects of this. So it's quite bizarre, and it made me laugh my head off, basically, that somebody from... This happens again and again. People from outside of the field will chime in with what they believe to be true, and it was just hilarious. So there you go.
I don't know if this spawned it or if it happened at the same time, but there was another Twitter meme that was happening, and it was based on the idea of science fiction is this, fantasy is that.
Yes, yeah.
And I remember one in particular from Linda Carter, who said that science fiction is inventing materials that can deflect bullets and allow me to fly an invisible jet. Fantasy is thinking you'd ever get a date with me.
Very good.
And, various famous people, actors, writers, directors, all had their own take on that meme, and they would always bring their own works into it. It was fun to watch peripherally.
Great. I think I said I had two present things, but I've just scrolled through, scrolled to the next page of my notes, and I find I've got a third present item. So I'll just throw that one in as well. I've talked about this several times before on the podcast, but I've finally got hands on a physical copy of the UHD Blu-ray of Star Trek The Motion Picture Director's Edition. So it's finally released in September on physical media, so I've had a chance to see it now. I'd seen the standard definition version that was done 20 years ago, but this is so much better, because for this version they've gone back to the original camera negatives of everything. They've gone to the original camera negatives of the original special effects and the live action footage. They've recomposited everything from scratch. They've redone the soundtrack. They've even changed some of the dubbed in bits of dialogue with better recordings, and it is a far better film than you have ever seen before. Still not a great film, but it's a decent one now, because the film was released in an incomplete state. The original version of the film was a bit embarrassing to watch, but I think this new version does it justice and makes it as good as it can possibly be, given the script and the performances and so on. So that's out on physical media now, and it's pretty good.
I have a couple of present issues.
issues.
Topics. The first one is Mary Robinette Cole's book, The Spare Man, comes out October 11th.
Yay.
And if you enjoy her works and you pre-ordered it on Amazon or on Apple Books, you should go double-check your pre-orders because both of those companies lost the original set of pre-orders.
How can they do that?
And I don't know. It's a glitch. It's a mistake. It's something. But it happened to her Amazon pre-orders, and she was working with people saying, I'll talk to the company and see what we can do. In the meantime, please do replace your pre-orders because those pre-orders influence a lot of the long-term success of the book.
Yeah.
And then last week, she found out it had also happened to her iBooks pre-orders.
Oh, great.
My Barnes & Noble one seems to be doing just fine so far. And it's a good advertisement for working with small bookstores and ordering physical media. Maybe I will do that next time.
Yeah.
And then my other present one is also kind of a future one. It's a Kickstarter called Jewish Futures, managed by Ian Randall Strock and edited by the Hugo Award-winning Michael Burstein.
Mm-hmm.
It's fully funded. If you kick in money now, you are guaranteed to get the book with all of its stories. The further that it funds, the more stories there will be. And if it funds high enough, they'll make a second book as part of this entire project.
Terrific.
And it's based on the idea of what will Jewish people live like and be like in the future, whether that's 50 years or 5,000 years.
Right. And all of these are new stories, are they?
Yes.
Fantastic.
Yep. There's an author that's known for doing alternate histories, Turtle Dove. He's on board for writing a story.
Great. I've got one future item, which you alluded to earlier on. The auction of Harlan Ellison stuff. And it's to support a proposed memorial library. So the basic idea behind this is Harlan died, I think, in 2018 or thereabouts. And he was survived by his wife, Susan. She then died a couple of years after that. And so the Ellison's house, full of all of Harlan's stuff, and he had a load of stuff, a load of books and artwork and memorabilia, as well as all his working papers and books and all of that. And it's an architecturally fascinating house as well, because he had this lost Aztec temple of Mars built into his house, and there's all sorts of hidden sections of the house and all sorts of things. So it's a really fascinating place. I've never been in. I drove past it once, but I've never been there. But it's an amazing place. What to do with it when he's gone and his wife has gone as well? The Ellison estate had J. Michael Straczynski named as the literary executor. So he's taking care of everything to do with what happens to Ellison's work at this point. And he is also trying to establish the Harlan and Susan Ellison Foundation, which is a non-profit which will turn the Ellison's house into what he, Straczynski, calls a place dedicated to writing, creativity, art and music. And he's calling it a memorial library. It'll be, this is what he says, full of books, 50,000 of them, full of art, comics, amazing architecture, complete with a tower, hidden rooms, gargoyles and the lost Aztec Temple of Mars. And it will serve fans of Harlan's work, but also lovers of art and books and architecture, as well as academics who will be able to study his manuscripts and decades of correspondence. This is one of these ironic things. In order to be able to fund this place as a going concern, as a place that people can go into, either as a museum exhibit or somewhere you can go in and do research, in order for that to happen, there needs to be some funding. Now, the Ellisons didn't die with a huge amount of cash money lying around, so where do you get money from? The only thing you can do is sell off some of the stuff. So that's what this auction is about. It's not everything being sold, it's selected items are being sold off in order to raise funds to establish the foundation, which can then do this thing with the Ellisons' property. So it's kind of a long-term plan. But the auction is imminent. I think it's towards the end of October 2022, and there's loads of artwork and other things being sold. The auction house is an auction house that does wonderful catalogues, and you can get the catalogue online. I haven't actually looked at this catalogue yet, but I'm planning to do so. But I've seen their previous catalogues for previous auctions, and they do wonderful catalogues, loads of high-quality images of the materials that they sell. So even if you hate Ellison and you can't stand his fiction, go and have a look at the catalogue for this auction, because you'll be amazed at the kinds of things that are being sold.
I think one of the marquee items is a picture of him with William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy in costume.
Yes.
They're in costume. He's not.
Yes. And signed by the actors. That was used as the cover for, I don't know if it was the first edition, but an early edition of the book City on the Edge of Forever, which contains Harlan's script for the Star Trek episode. So that's the cover photo on there. It shows Spock and Kirk with their arms around Ellison, who's in the middle of the photo, and they've both signed it. So yeah, that original photo is part of the auction. Be interesting to see how much that goes for.
Yeah.
Any more future items?
My life right now is so immediately focused. I have not been looking out ahead very much.
That's fine.
Aside from for the arrival of a new book to read from Mary Robinette Cole.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. So, we've vacationed around the world, and we've laid the foundations for what we hope will become an ever-expanding list of science fiction destinations. We've discovered that the late Queen of England, and, well, Queen of the United Kingdom, I should say, was in more science fiction and fantasy than you could possibly imagine. And we've learned something about the past, present, and the future. And I think that brings us to a close.
Yeah.
So we say thank you for listening, and we hope you'll join us next time. We're Phil Nichols and Colin Kusky. Our theme tune is from purpleplanet.com. Look for the show notes on our website, 101sf.blogspot.com, where you can also buy us a coffee through the tip jar. And you can also find us as Science Fiction 101 on Facebook. Finally, please follow us or subscribe to us on your podcast app of choice. You'll find us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts. We also appreciate the odd 5-star review. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.